Anyone interested in winning an Olympic gold medal must select his or her parents very carefully. Most of us didn't choose our parents for their Olympic potential. But what if the habits of elite athletes could still teach us something about how we age? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, Corbin and I reflect on the insights of legendary physiologist Per-Olof Åstrand, and how even a quote as cheeky as "choose your parents wisely" can open up a rich conversation about genetics, training, resilience, and the power of choice in the aging process. Let's explore what it means to train for a lifetime of aging well. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health.
Dr. Armstrong, what was the quote you always shared in Physiology of Exercise?
You mean the Per-Olof Åstrand quote?
Yeah, that one, choosing your parents wisely.
Yeah, that one actually, I've always misquoted it in class. I always thought it was choose your parents wisely. But the actual quote is, anyone interested in winning an Olympic gold medal must select his or her parents very carefully.
I don't know how an individual is going to do that, really. You can't really choose your parents. So,
Well, that's not the point of it. And how do you know? How do you know that you don't choose your parents? This was something I picked up from my dad many, many years ago. He was a management consultant, did a lot of work with purpose, and he postulated that, what if we, before our conception, we're up there with our God, and it's like, okay, I want you to select who's going to parent you and how it's going to lead to your purpose. And, so we don't know. Maybe we do choose. Maybe you're, before your conception, you're like, yes, I am going to choose, this Kay Armstrong and Bill Armstrong to be my parents. And they're going to put me in the right circumstances to fulfill a certain purpose. How do we know? We don't know. It's not a matter of whether we really can or we can't. It's what are the implications for the parental situations into which we are born.
I don't think we can, but I think our parents choose each other, and then their genes, once they've chosen each other and have gone through that process of creating us, their gene kind of chooses who we are in the long run. I feel like that's just fourth grade biology,
Okay,
Anyway.
well, that negates our whole first S in the SPIES model. If we do think that there is purpose and, divine, and again, this is going on a whole different tangent. I don't want to dismiss people who maybe aren't inclined in that direction, but just kind of hypothetically, if we have a divine purpose, then there has to be some point to who we pick. But all of that aside, what Åstrand's really trying to say is that, we are a product of not only our genetics, but everything else that goes into the parents that we have been born to, and there's a lot more to it. And it's not just genetics aside. You can say, okay, well, you have siblings, your siblings are born of the same parents, but we all end up quite different. So what's all that mean?
Are you saying genetics, they don't really matter, or they do matter?
Well, I'm saying that genetics play a much smaller role in who we become than we want to believe. A lot of times people are going to blame, I just got bad genetics. Well, there's a lot more to the genetics than just, the X and Y chromosomes. It's in the DNA. It's, about, I think it's roughly, and again, it's generally postulated. It's not something that is as quantifiable, but if you kind of go into much of the, the science, the exercise science textbooks, they're going to say that, your performance, your athleticism, your health, those types of things, about 20 to 30% of that is genetics. The rest is behavioral. And so much of who we are the behaviors that we choose. And I would argue that, our parents choose from the moment of conception and maybe even beyond. We've talked about epigenetics. I've said in classes lately more that it's maybe not as much a matter of choose your parents wisely, but choose your grandparents wisely. Because we know that if our grandparents are going through certain stressful circumstances during the period of time when they're going through puberty and the eggs and the sperm are forming in their body, that can lead a lasting impression that can carry over through generations. And so I think what Åstrand really is meaning is it's not necessarily just Olympians, but any of us, our performance is going to be largely dependent upon our parents, grandparents, and the circumstances into which we are born.
Man, there's a lot to take in there. So, but aren't most people limited to their genetics? Like they're limited by inactivity and poor habits.
Okay, poor habits and activity is not genetics. So, let's kind of what do genetics give us? Well, if we look at what is passed on from our parents, our grandparents, genetically, of course you get, your appearance, your eye color, hair color, whether or not you are going to go bald, which I was always told it was supposed to come from the mother's side. But if you're an Armstrong, it's coming from the Armstrong side. I don't care. You're going bald. When we look at what's affecting our genetics, we got to look at, again, it's your appearance, but from a performance standpoint, what is your kind of baseline VO2 max? And for listeners that might not be aware of what VO2 max is, that's the measure of our ability to consume and utilize oxygen for physical performance. And so there's a baseline of that is largely dependent upon our body size, the size of our heart, size of our lungs, how much hemoglobin our body is carrying, how we're able to utilize oxygen, even our mitochondrial DNA, all those types of things. And then you have fiber types, whether you're fast twitch, slow twitch fiber types, your body proportions, whether you're a melodic build or, whether you have long torso, short torso, big bone, small bone, the list goes on. So all these factors that affect performance come from our genetics. And we can think of that more as the hardware of the system. So we get our hardware from our parents and our grandparents. So you're either born a Apple computer, MacBook Pro, or you're born some cheap knockoff. That is kind of where we are. How much RAM power do you have in how much processing power do you have innately in your human computer? And that's the basis at which we can build off of training wise. Training builds onto that so much more. So we can improve our VO2 max. If we have a low initial VO2 max, we have a greater capacity to be able to elevate that. Generally, if you're born with kind of an innate high VO2 max, there's not going to be a lot of improvement within that. Most of us are in that moderate range. So we have a fair amount to which we can improve that. We can alter our fiber type to a certain degree based on training, but we're going to be kind of limited with that. And so we have a certain baseline endurance, strength, recovery capacity. And then within our genetics, we also have a certain degree to which we are going to be responders and non-responders to training. So that's our genetic piece, but there's more to your computer operation if we're going to use that analogy. What software do you put into that? And David Epstein in his book, The Sports Gene, uses an analogy I really like where he talks about it's both a hardware and a software issue. And so we have the hardware, but what kind of programming are we going to put into that? That's the training, that's the experience that we're having, it's the amount of effort and work that we're putting into that. And so some of that can be genetic. There is certain level of evidence that athletes have a higher pain threshold, and that's why they're able to perform to a greater extent. But some of that can be, programmed into us as well. We can learn to push our bodies a little bit harder to train harder. And so we're not just simply limited by the genes that we get, we have to consider, well, what else is contributing to that? I use as an example in class Michael Phelps, who, if you look at Michael Phelps, and it's been a while, I think, since he's competed. So some of our younger listeners might not entirely know who he is, but if you don't know who Michael Phelps are, you don't know Olympic swimming. Michael Phelps physiologically was born to be the level of elite swimmer that he was born. He chose his parents wisely, and he had, just the perfect proportions. He's, long torso, shorter legs, really long arms, big hands, big feet. Purportedly, I think he is supposed to have webbed toes. I don't know if that's really true, but his body type is perfect for swimming. But what if he chose parents that never gave him access to a pool? He never learned to swim. Maybe his parents were really into basketball, and so he was pushed into basketball, and he was a mediocre basketball player at best, maybe played third string on the high school team, never did anything else. And here's an Olympian in waiting that never got the opportunity because he wasn't born into the right circumstances. And you look at being born in, maybe you have the right genetics to be an elite long distance runner, but you're born at sea level instead of altitude. That's going to make a difference in your capacity to perform. And so that's where I think there's a bit more, and probably a lot more beyond just simply the genetics, that leads into this question of, choosing our parents wisely to be able to perform. And we're also not necessarily talking about, Olympians as well. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Well, you mentioned epigenetics, and if we're going off this, it kind of seems that we use the term aging well starts at conception, but it almost seems like it starts before conception at this point. Like, if there's stress on the parents and they are adapting to that, or if they're constantly going to the gym or running or whatever, then that gene kind of passes down onto us because their bodies have adapted to those physical needs, and they can almost pass that on to us. But then as far as the Olympian status goes, it's not just the genetic piece that's pushing on. It's almost like the door of opportunities that are happening as well. If you're using the metaphor of Michael Phelps possibly being a basketball player, because the door of opportunity to get him into a pool to experience this passion and love for swimming, that if that never opened up for him, then he would have never became an Olympian. Is that kind of what you're saying as far as picking your parents? Is that what you're meaning by that?
That's exactly what I've been saying. And so, we talk about aging well beginning before conception. And so if you want to kind of build off of that parenting model, okay, yes, you have the genes, but from the moment you are conceived, and again, I wouldn't even go backtrack before the conception, because again, we have the epigenetics coming from potentially the grandparents, maybe stuff that's happening to the parents as they are going through puberty and producing the sperm and the egg that are going to ultimately have the potential to make children for them. You have the circumstances under which that conception occurs. Then you have all the activities that might happen during the pregnancy. What kind of nutrition did the mother get? What kind of stress was she under? Where were you born in your birth order? If you have siblings, we know that firstborn, middleborn, youngest are always going to have some slightly different advantages, disadvantages based on birth position that's going to affect their personality and the outcomes in their life. So maybe you have an older sibling. I think of the sport of wrestling, how many really prominent wrestling families there are out there that just, 3 or 4 brothers, and now sisters involved in those families that get involved in the sport because an older sibling, got involved in the sport. Or, you have a parent that was involved in the sport. The oldest sibling gets involved. The oldest sibling has success. The youngest siblings are following along, going to their competitions. And so they get actively involved in that particular sport. I'm amazed at the number of twins involved in the sport of wrestling. I think of Troy and Terry Steiner. Troy's a good friend of mine. Used to coach here at Oregon State. And we connected when I had the Athletic Republic facility. He and his brother are two very prominent, well-known wrestlers in the United States. They both wrestled for Iowa and for the U.S. national team. And, I could list countless other pairs of brothers that, have wrestled at the most elite levels. And you think there's an advantage in that sport. You have a twin, you have an innate competitor within your own family that, you wrestling around the house is going to build your skill, build your desire to participate in that sport. So, there's a lot more that goes into this whole idea of our performance. And again, we want to make sure that we're focusing as well, not just on elite athletes, but on successful agers as well.
Well, I guess that kind of brings up the question. How much of aging well is actually trainable if it comes down from our parents and our grandparents?
I would say more than 80%, probably almost all of it, because trying to remember the guest I had on recently that I interviewed who happened to have a twin. I kind of wish I could remember exactly which. I'm drawing a blank right now. But, they mentioned that, their twin didn't follow the same pattern. Different eating habits. I think the twin might even have smoked. And so definitely not aging as well. And, if you have two twins who go down a different pathway, maybe one starts smoking or, they've done the studies, vegetarian versus more meat-based diet, and seen differences in how those twins are measuring on a number of different biomarkers. And so the choices that we make are going to have an impact on how we age. And so from a very early age, if, we can have the best genetics possible, you have parents who come from a line of, all your grandparents were octogenarians, your parents are fit, they eat healthy, and you rebel against that and say, well, no, I'm just going to eat McDonald's the rest of my life. I'm not going to exercise. I don't care about my body fat. And I'm going to stay up late. I'm going to drink. You're not going to age well.
Right.
And those genetics might protect you some, but ultimately it's going to be those life choices. Just take cigarette smoking alone. If you smoke, you are going to shorten your life.
Yeah.
And yes, you might find those rare people who they are octogenarians and they smoked a pack of cigarettes their entire life. That is a rare individual. And I would make the argument that how much longer would they have lived if they did not smoke?
Well, not only that, but if we're going off the epigenetics concept, it's not only affecting their bodies, it's affecting their future children and their future grandchildren just by smoking that pack a day. Because we know the negative effects that smoking has on our bodies, and if that gets passed on, who knows what side effects that can occur with the next generation of the very first smoker in the family. That's a crazy concept, but if anything, it should be motivating individuals to just not smoke even more. That should be just another reason not to do it. So that's way to go, Dr. Armstrong. Coming in hot. So it's almost as if every decision that an individual makes, whether it's not smoking, whether it's eating healthy, whether it's working out, it's whatever external stress that we're putting on the body that's adapting, that can possibly get passed on to the next generation. And if we go off the concept of Olympic athletes, what elite athletes do intentionally, older adults, they can actually utilize that and adapt it practically.
Yeah, to a certain extent. And I think I've mentioned numerous times on the podcast that I'm not a big fan of one of the trends in the fitness industry where we are pushing people to train like an athlete. We have a lot of these gyms that are, high intensity, CrossFit style training, or even just, plyometrics that are done at the athletic level as opposed to a more practical level. Now, with that being said, when we're building strength is the same, whether you're an athlete, non-athlete. We're just trying to be able to push more weight more effectively. Speed is the same. We're not necessarily training for speed on the track, but, we want to be able to move with some level of intentionality, some level of efficiency. We want to have a good endurance capacity so we can adapt these training principles. And that's why when we talk about, the principles of adaptation in exercise science, they're the same whether you are an athlete or a non-athlete. You have the principle of overload, principle of progressive overload. You have specificity. So, specificity, if you want to build strength, you got to train for strength. If you want to build endurance, you got to train for endurance. And I think those get muddied a lot when we talk about kind of practical fitness for people. A lot of people use the phrase, strength training, and they're doing, 15 to 20 repetitions. You are not training for strength when you're doing 15 to 20 repetitions. And so, plyometrics, being able to transfer a landing mechanic, so an eccentric contraction into a more forceful concentric contraction, can have practical implications for the aging adult as well. And so when we're talking about training, we can unlock our potential, whether we have that genetic potential to be an elite Olympic athlete or whether, we have very poor genetics, we can still unlock a certain level of potential by training appropriately as we age. And so we want to make sure that at any age, whether we've trained in the past or not, we are training most effectively to get the most out of the genetics that we have been given.
Train with a purpose, basically.
Right. I mean, our training should always be structured, should always be intentional.
All right, so let's discuss resistance training, movement quality, and aerobic conditioning as unlocking the potential at any age.
Okay, so what do you want to discuss? I mean, resistance training, again, you've got to lift heavier than you were used to lifting in order to get stronger. The more relative resistance that we are lifting, and I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about heavy lifting being, a 500-pound squat. It may only be a 100-pound squat for you. If that's what you can only lift for 1 or 2 repetitions, that's strength. That's where your strength is, and you can get stronger. Now, the more absolute strength we have, the harder it's going to be to maintain as we age, the more stressful it might be on our body, which is another reason why I don't like to say train like an Olympic athlete, because we don't need to be lifting an excessive amount of weight. We're not training for competition, because the more we're training toward an absolute strength, the more likely we are to get hurt. But the more we're training toward a functional strength, a strength that's going to allow us to perform better as we age, the more strength that we can maintain, the more muscle mass that we can, retain as we age. And then muscle endurance is different. That's the ability to sustain effort or to sustain repeated contractions over time. And so that's where we're doing higher repetitions and repeating things or holding an isometric contraction for a longer period of time is going to have benefit in there. And then when we look at aerobic fitness as well, again, we're not looking at running marathons. That's a different capacity. And it was Kenneth Cooper that said, if you're you're running for more than 30 minutes, you're doing it for more than your health. So people that are training for marathons, ultra marathons, are not necessarily doing that for their health. They're doing it for competitive purposes. We can get improvements in our VO2 max by simply training intensely for as little as 15 minutes. And we can get those improvements and get the health benefits of the exercise in more exercise snacking, where we're doing small bits of exercise over the course of a higher frequency. And so when we're looking at training for these things for older adults, it's really just a matter of, okay, how much function do we want to maintain or have as we get older? And what do we have to do minimally to be able to attain and retain that level of performance?
So I guess, Dr. Armstrong, could you give some specific examples of how an older adult benefits from this structure, intentional, like with an intentional training? Like what specifically can they do exercise wise?
I mean, they can do whatever they can do. I mean, we've talked in the past. We love those videos and clips and articles that talk about 5 exercises you should not be doing as you get older, as you hit a certain age. And all of that is BS when you really consider that we can do as much as we can do. And, if we go back in terms of resistance training, if we look at the basic 5, having a capacity to be able to do a squatting motion with as much weight as you can physically handle, the more weight you can handle, the more you're going to be able to do. It's more than just simply standing and sitting. You can lift things off the ground. You can lift up your grandchildren. You can carry more. There's a lot more that you can do the more that you can squat. And then you have kind of building off of that, the deadlift or the hip hinge. That's very much lifting off the ground. Both of those movements are required in order for us to be able to pick up anything. And the heavier thing that we can pick up, the more functional we're going to be. If we can't pick up anything or we can't stand effectively, then that's going to impact all of any activities that we can possibly do. And then we get into kind of upper body strength with the horizontal push, vertical push, and pulling movements. Those rounding out the 5, the more that we can push pull, again, the more activities that we're able to do. So to come up with examples is almost impossible because it's like, oh, well, what do you want to do aging well? I mean, if you want to hike, being able to go on a hike, the stronger your legs are in the deadlift and the squat, the easier it's going to be to push your body up a hill or to climb a set of stairs or pedal a bike, do any of those types of things. The pushing and pulling. I mean, there are people in their 80s, 90s, even 100s that are still rock climbing and doing things like that. That's pulling motions. Being able to push yourself, get up off the ground if you fall. First of all, I think if you have better strength, remember if we look at Carmine's law, that balance equals strength plus posture. And so having proper strength, being able to stand erectly in the best possible posture is going to help us to stay within our base of support. But if we have strength, is that balance is disrupted, we're going to be able to right our body positioning faster and more effectively to prevent the fall. And so the stronger we are, the more overall fitness that we have, the less likely we are to fall. If we do happen to fall, our body is going to be able to sustain that fall more likely with less risk of a break, less risk of injury, and we can get up. We can push ourselves up off of the ground. We can get off the ground if we do happen to fall. Do you need more examples? I mean, I think it's a no-brainer that...
Yeah. Well, there's obviously, I mean, the reason why I ask is because there's going to be some listener where they're listening and they're like, yeah, that's great resistance training, but what does that look like? So by you providing those examples, at least someone hearing this can say, okay, now I have a game plan and now I can go in the gym and now I can train with a purpose and start my first steps of aging well that way with a purpose. Because all in all, it seems that aging well takes training, not just movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, movement is the baseline. If you are moving as much as possible, then you're going to be able to sustain health more effectively. The more we push, and then training doesn't have to be in the gym per se. It doesn't have to be on the treadmill. It doesn't have to be on the bike. It can just simply be moving with a higher level of effort involved. If we look at the people in the blue zones, most of those octogenarians are not going to the gym. They're not taking their supplements and their protein powders and all that kind of stuff. They're just living lifestyles that are of a higher quality, higher quantity of movement that is permitting them to sustain muscle mass, sustain the capacity to be able to move. And so how much we want to be able to move as we age is going to require that we sustain that level, probably actually a little bit more movement in order to be able to do that. So if I want to be able to hike up a steep incline, I need to have the strength necessary to do that. Now, walking that same hill every day can allow me to maintain that level of effort. Maybe carrying things up that hill is going to give me a capacity to be able to, without those packages or whatever I'm carrying, be able to sustain that effort more effectively. And so we have to, you have the principle of overload, you have the principle of progression. Now, progression gets a little bit challenging when we're talking about aging well. I mean, you're not going to progress forever. Your progression in your 20s is generally, if that's when you start training, is going to begin to plateau in your 30s, 40s, to get into your 50s and 60s. If you've been training hard and training regularly, training with intention, you're probably not going to see significant improvements in your later years. But if we can maintain that level, then we're going to have a much, much higher level of function in our advanced years. Even if we decrease that a little bit, we still have a higher function relative to other people. But if you start late in life, you can progress for a good period of time. You may not see as much progression, but you're going to see improvement. And so training isn't necessarily athletic training. It's just simply pushing the body system to a level greater than that to which it is accustomed. And so it involves movement, but it's not just simply moving, because we've talked about this in the past, where when we've pushed just like cardiovascular exercise in the aging population and no strength training, that ability to perform that cardiovascular effort is going to decline over time, because we're not able to maintain the strength necessary to maintain that level of performance. If we see sarcopenia occur, we see atrophy in the muscle occur because we're not actively overloading or at least hitting a level of maintenance volume in the muscle, we're going to see a loss of muscle function over time. We see a loss in muscle function. We can't move as well. We don't move as well. We begin to see that, the principle of reversibility kick in, that use it or lose it. And so if I'm not able to run as fast as I did 20 years ago, I'm not going to be able to maintain the same level of cardiovascular function as I did 20 years ago, simply because I'm not able to do that level of work anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It seems like it's better to be consistent instead of increasing intensity all the time, because as you said, as we age, we're not going to be able to maintain that intensity. And as you've also mentioned, it's don't necessarily keep the intensity of an athlete and train like an athlete. It's better to just be consistent across the board. As that's my take home message of what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if you say you're an athlete, and the easiest to look at is going to be like a strength athlete, some of your strongman competitors, many of your most elite bodybuilders, even look at like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold still trains well into his, 70s now, probably pushing 80.
Yeah.
Still in really, really great shape. He's not lifting near what he was back in his prime, but he's still pushing hard, still lifting hard, and still able to maintain a pretty significant level of strength relative to others. And so it's what level of performance do you want to maintain? You have to be pushing yourself to that level to maintain that. Otherwise, we fall below our maintenance volumes and we start to see the principle of reversibility kick in. It makes absolutely no sense for him to train like he did back in the 70s and the 80s when he was competing and making his movies, in his prime. I mean, in his Conan the Barbarian days and all that, because he's not competing. The stress level on the body in order to maintain that level of performance is just unsustainable. And so he would be doing more harm to his body continuing to train like that. So we make the adjustments to be able to get the best possible performance out of the body that we can as we age. And going back to kind of genetics may give us a little bit more sustainability. Some of us, it's a little bit harder in our 60s to get significant gains out of our training, but we can still be strong. We can still be fit no matter what our age is, no matter what our genetics are, if we continue to put the effort into it.
And so you also mentioned blue zones earlier, and I kind of want to circle back around to epigenetics and not just blue zones per se, but other geographical locations. Do you think those environmental adaptations are going to play a role in how someone ages? Like we know that high levels of altitude with the lower levels of oxygen can actually produce more mitochondria, right? So do you think people that live in higher levels of heat or higher levels of cold or higher levels of altitude, do you think that's going to play a role in their bodies adapting?
Well, of course, because the environment always impacts our physiology. I don't know that it's going to necessarily impact us epigenetically. I just don't know if there's any evidence of that. There might be a little bit, but we do know that, for example, if you take a Kenyan runner who born and raised at altitude, circumstantially kind of put in a situation in Kenya to promote running, because we know that the average annual income in Kenya is very small, and it's a motivation for somebody to, come to the United States, get a college scholarship, be on a track team, get an education, and continue to run competitively, where the purses in some of these big marathons is almost a lifetime of income back in Kenya. And they stay in the United States, they have children. Those children rarely become the same level of athlete that the parent was, because they don't have the motivation financially to run. They don't have the opportunities. I mean, going to school in the U.S., you're going to more than likely have a bus pick you up almost right in front of your house instead of having to walk to a bus stop anymore. They may, get involved in cross country and do some of those things, but they're not born into that advantage of being at altitude unless maybe they happen to take themselves, to an area that is higher level of altitude. And so heat, altitude, all those types of things give us a level of adaptation that's going to enable us to perform more effectively. And so older adults need to adapt to their environment if they're not used to that environment. So if you're born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's always hot, you're going to have a much higher level of adaptiveness to that heat. So you're not going to be you're going to be more heat tolerant. If you're in altitude, you're going to be more altitude tolerant, because you're going to just naturally have a higher red blood cell count. Even if you leave altitude and move to sea level, you're going to maintain that higher level of red blood cell concentration than other individuals who are maybe spend a short period of time at altitude and then move down to sea level. So hydration needs are a little bit different. Our recoverability in those environments are going to be different. Our thermoregulation are different. But the more we train in those environments, the more our body adapts, the better we're going to be able to perform in those. So whether you are an elite athlete or whether you're an average Joe or Jane, you are going to be able to adapt to the circumstances in which you put yourself and train yourself. But you have to be purposeful in terms of seeking those adaptations. If you move to Phoenix, Arizona, where it's hot to retire, but you spend 90% of your time in an air-conditioned car or house, and you're very rarely outside, you're not exercising out in the heat, you're not doing yard work in the heat, you're not going to see adaptations to that heat. Same thing, if you go to altitude, you're going to see some adaptation, but the adaptation is going to be greater the more you're stressing your body in that environment.
So would you suggest that an individual simulates those external adaptations by maybe adding a part of their training with a purpose routine, like a sauna or a cold plunge? I mean, it's not necessarily in their
Sauna or cold
environment.
plunge have
Okay.
nothing to do with training adaptation, but you can benefit from those. There are physiological benefits from that. Those aren't necessarily going to stimulate training adaptations. And I would not recommend, particularly for an aging adult, doing those things, first of all, without any consultation with their physician. But, forcing yourself into excessive amounts of heat probably not the wisest thing, or, intentionally really exercising in extreme cold without allowing your body to adapt to those things. And is it necessary to train under those conditions if you're never going to be in those conditions, if you're not competing? Putting undue stress on the body is not going to benefit us as we age as much as it puts us at a greater risk of having adverse events happen during exercise. And so I would be cautious about any of that. Just understand that when you are in environments that are more extreme, you need to acclimatize to those. You need to be considerate of how conditioned is my body for this environmental circumstance.
Whether you're training or training in a specific environment, it seems to me that an individual needs to become a student of their own body, right? And not just consumer health advice, like hopping into a bucket of ice or going into a sauna after workout. It's almost they have to kind of figure out what works best for them. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be smarter than the social influencers out there that are telling you to do all this stuff for your health, that don't understand that we are all different. There's that principle of individuality. What works for David Goggins is not going to work for 99% of the population. And so be smart about what you're attempting to do. Know your body's condition, know how adapted you are to the environment and to the activity that you're doing. And for God's sakes, consult your physician before you undergo any of these extreme levels of training or activity. Again, even elite athletes need to be students of their body and not just consumers of health advice or, following blindly what their coaches are having them do. I mean, how many athletes die every year because they have a dumbass coach that pushes them too hard and doesn't understand the principle of individuality or the basic principles of adaptation and think it's all about mind over matter bullshit. But
Well, I mean, that's actually a really good point, and it brings up a good question. What about mindset? Because Astrid also pointed out confidence, motivation, and discipline that plays a role as well.
yeah, I mean, these are all psychological qualities that matter certainly for athletes. And, if you're going to be a Olympic medalist, you have to have the right mindset. And a lot of that comes from our parents. We can learn from our parents' work ethic. We can learn, and maybe it's from coaches and things like that, but we also learn how to train. We learn how to motivate. Our confidence levels are made or broken by the people around us. We can have potentially great athletes that get a crappy coach that doesn't seem to know how to motivate them and causes them to not like a sport anymore that they are very, very good at. That person's not going to continue to perform. And so that carries over even to the aging population. If we had a PE teacher in high school, elementary school, whatever, that turned us off from exercise, we're not going to carry on into our advanced years. If we have gotten out of shape and we don't have the confidence that we can get back into shape, that's going to limit us from being able to return to a higher level of performance. I worked a number of years ago with a group of women at Eastern Michigan University. It was kind of a pilot study looking at a program to improve fitness. We recruited primarily overfat women, unconditioned, and pretty intensive and interesting program. But some of the stuff that I encountered in working with that program is I had one woman in particular who was very unfit, very much overweight, and she struggled with a lot of physical activity. And I just saw barriers come down right and left with her as we worked with her. One was she and her husband both had bikes. They wanted to be able to use them, but to be able to ride their bikes, they had to make it up this large hill in order to, be able to exercise on them. And they couldn't bike up the hill. And so I'm like, well, why don't you can you put them on your car and take them somewhere where you can bike? And she's like, I can do that? It's like, absolutely. And barrier came down. And we were showing them how to use some of the equipment in the health and wellness center there on campus. And she didn't know how to get on a bike. She sees everybody just kind of, as they get on a bike, they just kind of swing their leg up and get on the saddle of the bike and start pedaling. But to her, that was awkward. It was not ladylike, and it wasn't something she felt she can do. I'm like, well, can't you just kind of step up on center of the bike there, push your body up, and then just sit on the seat? I can do that. Of course you can. So a lot of this is just simply having the mindset that you can do these things and getting away from the attitude that you can't do things.
It kind of goes back to that old saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. But also a psychological quality. You mentioned how some people, they just don't like working out. Do you think that, for example, running, 90% of people don't like running. If you mention running, they're like, no. And do you think a lot of that has to do with maybe when they were younger, either a PE teacher or a coach used running as a form of punishment, and now psychologically we see that as a negative thing versus like, man, we should want to work out, we should want to go to the gym, we should want to train with a purpose and be comfortable with being uncomfortable because it makes us better. And if we could get over that psychological hump and just realize like, hey, this may suck in the moment, but it's going to pay off in the long run. I just feel like that is a huge, I just feel like if people can embrace that, it's going to be night and day for their journey as they age well.
Is there a question in there? Or?
Yeah, do you think it's people not wanting to work out or not wanting to train? They're associating it with a negative aspect, and they're having a hard time getting over that psychological hump, that mountain.
The reasons why people exercise or don't exercise are as broad as the number of people that we're talking about. It's some people are disillusioned with exercise. Some have fear from the get-go that they just can't do things. Maybe they've been told they couldn't do things. Maybe they've been forced to do things, and that causes them to be negative towards exercise. I think the key is, finding, we always talk about find your why to exercise. And I don't think it's that hard for people to find why they should exercise. The biggest challenge comes in finding your why not and getting past that why not and turning that into a reason to be exercising or motivation to be exercising. If I'm not exercising because I can't get my bike up the hill, well, how can I get it up the hill? If I'm not exercising because I had a PE teacher that I didn't like in high school, how do I get over that and exercise in a way that's going to be pleasurable to me and not bring up negative memories of the past?
Well, I know one thing that really motivates me is when I have a workout buddy or an accountability person, or if I'm training in a group. So I think that community or social support, I think that really, really helps. I know it breaks down my mental barrier, and just having someone that comes to the gym that knows proper form, proper technique, can also push me out of my comfort zone, and someone that I trust that's going to be able to spot me if I'm lifting heavier or I'm about to hit a personal record in whatever, just someone that knows what I'm doing. We have the same mindset, but also won't allow me to fail. If I'm like, I don't want to do it. And they're like, yes, you can. Come on. I know that having that sense of community-based workout really encourages me. What about you? I know you're more of an individual person. So what would you recommend for someone that's trying to start this fitness journey? Would you recommend more of a individual style, or would you recommend more of a community style? And which one has more perks? What would you suggest?
Well, I would suggest do what works for you.
Mhm.
I mean, there's no one better than the other. I prefer to lift at home just because I hate going to gyms where I have to either wait on equipment or, deal with my psychological responsiveness to people who are not doing techniques correctly or wasting time in the gym, kind of getting in my way. I just like to get in, get my exercise done, but not everybody's the same. And so you can't tell everybody that this is what you need to do. There's not an absolute when it comes to exercising, no matter what the influencers might tell you. There are no absolute ones when it comes to exercise. The only absolute is that you need to be doing it. You got to figure out how to do it.
Also, breaking down that psychological wall, I do think for someone that is going to be starting their journey and they're thinking like, oh, I don't want to go to the gym, I don't want to look dumb. It's like people really aren't paying attention to you. And my personal experience of all the gyms that I have gone to and worked out at and trained at, that gym culture is really encouraging. I love it because I feel like people are there for their own goals, but people are really supportive and will give you a fist bump once they see you hitting your goals to keep you encouraged. And so that barrier of like, oh, I don't want to go because I don't want to embarrass myself. I would recommend just getting over that, and people are there to hit their own goals, and you could run into a lifelong workout buddy. Just so now I'm a huge advocate for the social support aspect of physical training. I think it's really cool.
Well, not all have the same experience. So, you got to do what works for you.
Right. Okay. So Dr. Armstrong, what's the takeaway from today's discussion?
Well, I think, the main takeaway is that our genetics are a basic foundation. They're not the blueprint to our success. They give us a starting point. Everyone can benefit from good structured training. We need to focus on the principles of adaptability, or adaptability, if I can spit that out, and looking at things like progressive overload, the principle of specificity, the principle of reversibility, and then really underscoring that principle of individuality, and then trying to focus on having the right mindset, not worrying necessarily about all of the metrics that come along with exercise. Just keep it simple, move daily, do some strength, do some endurance type of work. Make sure that you are adapting appropriately to the climate, that you are working on the intensity level, the duration level of exercise that you're doing. Always build up slowly. Keep in mind the many social rhythms that come with exercise and how do we interact with others when it comes to exercise, what works for us, what doesn't work. The main thing is just commit to growing physically and mentally. And so consider what else it means for you to choose your parents wisely. What circumstances have you gotten from your parents? Have they been motivating you to exercise? Or are they the demotivators? Have they taught you proper nutrition, or do you need to relearn your nutrition information? Do you know how to exercise? Have you been given a good example from your parents? What examples have you gotten? So just realize that it goes beyond the genetics that you get from your parents. Be grateful, if you don't have great genetics, be grateful for the motivation that they've given you, the sense of determination that you get from your parents, all the other psychological, all the spies principles that come from your parents beyond just the physical genetics. So remember that our environment, our geography, the experiences that we've had over life, any opportunities or lack of opportunities we have, those are all going to benefit us. And so you may or may not have chosen your parents wisely, but you alone can choose how you live, how you train, and how you age. Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.